Well, that's a pretty unique track. You've got another spotlight on the album called Freedom, which is probably the one you mentioned earlier, and it has got to be a Jeff Berlin title, Freedom instead of Freedom.
Right, it is my title for a tune that I played triplets on. It's actually not in 3; it's more in 12. But let's not be too detail oriented. It's a lot of triplets. I thought it would be good to do that, and I wrote this. I worked on this for weeks. I mean, adding sections, removing sections, adding counterpoint, trying things. I work hard on these little bass pieces. They kind of exhaust me, to be honest, because they take a lot of work. Because I know they endure. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I didn't want to do it for its own sake and not have meaning in it. So, but this I feel is great. My only problem is that it was mixed a little too brightly, and I'm tempted to re-record it sometime in the future.
Well, you can. You've got the freedom to do it. I mean, the freedom to do it.
I do.
I could tell that was a technique oriented. It was like you say, the triplets. It was kind of based on the technique, and then the music flew out of that, or grew out of that. Last time you were here, I asked if there was anyone you'd always wanted to work with but never had the chance, and you mentioned saxophonist Wayne Shorter. He's very well represented on both of the albums we're discussing today. On HBC, you covered several compositions associated with Wayne and Weather Report, as you said, including Footprints, Mysterious Traveler, Sightseeing, and D-Flat Waltz. D-Flat Waltz is the one that I was saying seems like it would be hard to get tight. During the structure of it, you all have to hit it a certain way. And that's probably the one that's really grown on me, because Scott Henderson's soloing on that track. It's like truly something to behold. It's kind of the kind of thing that makes you want to put your guitar back in the case and just never open it again, because, after hearing that, what's the point? It reminds me.
What the point is? To try ever the more.
Yeah, I'm just saying this.
Scott was like the rest of us, and I agree with you, Scott. I commented on the last tour. I said, I really don't feel good soloing after Scott. Scott has pedals, huge sound, Marshall cabinets, roaring sound, great. 20, 30 years of experience playing these wonderful solos, and I come out with a chorus pedal, and I said, it's just, it doesn't have the same impact, and it doesn't sound as good, because my ears are better than my playing, and I know that I fall short in regards to playing music that I hoped to play at this time in my life. I'm actually a little disappointed in what I do, so I agree with you, but when I say disappointed, I'm not, going to, be totally depressed as much as I'm a little inspired. I have a plan to work very hard this year to practice a lot in order to really improve what I do in order to become a better musician. But that doesn't take away from the great guitar playing whatsoever that Scott demonstrated on D-Flat Waltz.
Well, I'm sure there's tons of bass players listening right now who'd be really depressed to play like Jeff Berlin.
Well, I you know what? These days I'm the old man. I mean, there's Hadrian Farad. There's guys with 10 times my technique. There's musicians way more fast. Maybe it's logical. It's come the time now that when I came up, Stanley came up, Jocko was everybody's hero. Mm-hmm. People built on us. They grew from that, and the new generation can outplay any of us old guys. 10 notes to one, I know it's not important, you play a lot of notes, but the technique element and the physical phenomenon that is Hadrian Farad and these other guys is stunning. I can't do that stuff, so I'm kind of more engaged to find purpose in the music that I'm playing, because I can't do what they do. I've actually always had a neat little trick. If somebody plays fretless, I won't. If somebody plays six string, I won't. If somebody plays tweeters, I won't. If somebody plays active, I won't. And I always found that if I kept as far away from things that people do, I was inevitably going to find something that was my own. And that sort of worked for me. So now, because I'm not able to kind of do the kind of physical playing that the bass players do today, I just think it's not ever going to be possible for me. I did my so-called speed weed stuff in the past, but I never felt comfortable doing it. I'll tell you the truth. I'd rather, if I could have made a career at playing slower, I would have, and I'm going to do it now. I'm going to play less notes because, frankly, I find more beauty in it. Anyways, I know I'm pontificating here, but I don't want people to feel, I wish you could sound whatever. I don't think anyone would think that about me. I'd rather they would know that I'm interested, that all these guys become better players and are happy in their music.
Yeah, but what everybody's hearing is, you have your own standards and you've accomplished certain things and you want to play a certain way and sound a certain way and do a certain thing. But like you said, in one day you knocked out this whole album, and most players are never going to be able to do that at all, ever. Period. So.
Yeah, that was a good. I had already been prepared. I mean, I took a deep breath and let's hit the record button, and certainly fixed a couple of boo-boos, certain things I could never live with.
Right.
And then but
that's good. It just means that you were freewheeling when you were playing. You weren't worried about it, and that's when you just played what played and go back and fix it if something's egregious. But
I did just play. Correct.
All this reminds me of that story. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, about a guy who tells a saxophone player, he says, "Man, all you're doing is imitating Charlie Parker." So the guy hands this critic his sax, and he says, "Here, you imitate him."
Very meaningful. Sure, very meaningful.
Well, your versions of these Weather Report songs, they retain the chops and the spirit of the originals, but of course they aren't carbon copies, and why would you want them to be? So what was your band philosophy regarding how you wanted your versions to differ from the originals? Because I noticed you changed the tempo on some of them.
We never discussed it. It wasn't an issue because we knew that, I was, a lot of these songs actually were not Jocko tunes, but Victor Bailey tunes.
Sure.
As Victor was more influenced, I would say, by Jaco Pastorius, there wasn't, in listening to the originals, something that I felt that I wanted to imitate as much as admire. So I didn't really think, nor did any of us think, about changing anything for its own sake. It was pretty well known that a guitar trio playing keyboard trio, a quintet or quartet music was never going to sound like the original. So we never really discussed it.
It was just a case of, well, we're not them. We don't have the same instrumentation as them. So even if we try to play the tunes exactly like them, it's automatically going to sound different anyway.
Automatically. It was never going to happen where we were going to sound like a Weather Report. Couldn't have happened. Frankly, we're more rock when we play live than anything. I mean, we do Come Together, and we rock that, and we do the blues. I mean, I'm surprised how much more inner rock we are, and how much more I love playing it. It's a fun thing. But in regards to the HPC CD, we never thought that we had to do anything in particular to change it. In fact, Scott imitated every note that Joe played on keyboards, or Herbie Hancock played on keyboards on the guitar. So because of the fact the instruments are so different, he never was going to sound like Herbie nor sound like Joe. But he imitated everything he could extract from the original recordings and played it on guitar.
Well, let's shift gears now and talk a little bit about Low Standards. We all remember that the Allman Brothers had 2 drummers in the band and Jefferson Airplane had 2 lead vocalists, but I can't think of a single band who had 2 bass players in it. In this trio recording, you have Mike Clark on the drums, yourself on the electric bass, and Richard Drexler alternating between the acoustic bass and the piano, which creates a lot of combination options. You can solo over his bass playing or his piano playing, and he can solo over your bass playing on either the bass or the piano. So how did you get the idea to try out this unusual instrumentation?
It came about because the fretted electric bass with a little chorus sounds utterly and absolutely nothing like a fretless electric bass or an acoustic bass instrument. And because the 2 instruments were so different, and because my interest was, for my own entertainment, I might add, to find things that are not typical of the bass, not necessarily lines or solos, but interactive, guide tone lines, I should say, lines that move in the harmony, chords that must generally be 1 or 2 or 3 notes. I don't like 4-note bass chords because it's too thick on the bass. And I discovered that if Rich played a low F, I could play an upper D, G, C on the bass, let's say. Mm-hmm. Even though I have other versions, and because there's no clash in the instrument, it worked. And Richard occasionally forgot. My only suggestion was stay low when I'm staying high on the neck. Mm-hmm. You stay low on your instrument. And if with this criteria of playing, what we came up with, in fact, it's been commented by critics, is maybe the most original bass record of all time because it's 2 bass players, not the originality of the impact of the great Jaco Pastorius on his first record, but the combination of 2 basses in such a manner that I don't think it's ever been recorded before, and people have said that. So it was a great opportunity for me to comp like a guitar and solo, hopefully like a horn player, while Richard played like a bass player. And when he soloed, I played chords. And what's remarkable about all these songs is Richard, you'll notice at the end of a song I'm playing chords and I keep playing. Richard put down the acoustic bass, walked to the acoustic piano, and then played a solo right after playing the upright bass. It was a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant demonstration. He's the one, for me, that made Lost Standards the album that made it as well received as it has been. I think it's my best record to date.
Yeah, it's really interesting to listen to, and that's one of the things about it. You can tell when he does that, because you guys are vamping. You can tell, sort of in a holding pattern, that he's transitioning from instrument to instrument. You can almost visualize it in your mind. And like you said, when both you and Richard are on bass, you have to assume what would normally be the role of guitar or piano in terms of providing chords and melody. So is that particularly challenging, or was it just kind of freeing to make the bass the center of attention and say, I don't have to worry about anybody else. It's a rhythm section, and then me playing high on the bass, sort of like a guitar. Do you think it would have worked with two electrics or two acoustics, or it had to be acoustic and electric?
It had to be acoustic and electric for it to work the way that it did. Yeah. And it was freeing because on a lot of my previous records, they were well-written albums, but the bass really wasn't a predominant instrument. Yeah. And sometimes in reflection, I thought, I should have probably played more on my own record. That's why High Standards previously was sort of the first crack at it. This record is Low Standards, which took, I would say, lesser-known standards, but still in the Wayne Shorter family of songs, because Wayne writes chords that are not typical in their harmonic motion. This causes, for me, an opportunity to find things that are not typical to be played on a bass guitar. See, it always comes down to music. It rarely comes down to technique. And that's why I chose a lot of those songs. Carla Bley song. I had a Steve Swallow song. I had Oliver Nelson song, I think. I'm very proud of this. Bill Evans, very early, harmonically, a twisted song. And it caused me to play twisted. It caused me, these songs, to dig deep, to find things that I normally wouldn't find. Music provokes improvement. Music provokes investigation. And if I'm on gigs, let's say, that don't require it, you won't believe it, but I'm real happy to play simple and not always have to be challenged. Sometimes it's just nice to play simple, rhythm section, joyful, calm, enjoyable, funky, groovy, funky.
Spice of life, that variety. Before we listen to a sample of this, I just want to say a word about Mike Clark. He's best known for his work with the Headhunters and Herbie Hancock, but he's also played with plenty of other top musicians like Vince Guaraldi, Phil Collins, and Les Claypool. I opened the podcast with an excerpt from your HBC version of Herbie Hancock's Actual Proof, which featured Mike Clark on drums on the original. So there's a little commonality there between these projects. Mike Clark is one of the most sampled drummers by hip-hop artists. His playing on the Headhunters track, God Make Me Funky, is a particular favorite of samplers and has not only appeared on, but actually been the backbone for literally millions of music sales, for which he's never seen a dime. I heard him say in one interview that he was okay with them using his playing, but he quite rightly felt that they should be compensating him for it, particularly considering the sales were in the millions. And he did say that the only artist who has ever sent him any money for using a sample of his playing was Prince. Apparently there weren't any lawyers pressuring him or anything. It was just a case of Prince finding out the source of the sample and taking it upon himself to do the right thing and send Mike a check, which was reportedly pretty substantial. So, let's pause a moment to give credit to the artist formerly known as a Symbol.
Well, I have a funny name for Prince. Prince, the artist formerly known as the artist formerly known as Prince.
Right. True.
That's how I looked at it.
Yeah, apparently.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, it is. Apparently he just didn't want he was a record company. It was a paperwork thing. He wanted to release albums without his name on it. It was some kind of loophole. But yeah, I was going to say, he was known as a Symbol, apparently a symbol of fairness, from Mike Clark's point of view.
Well, I agree. Prince did a very, very generous thing. He's obviously one of the most talented musicians. I love Prince. Always have. What a talent, man. And I think he did a very generous thing for Mike Clark.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that. Well, getting back to the album, as you said, one of the most exciting things about so many of the tracks is that moment where Richard Drexler switches instruments and it changes the whole sort of texture. Not from better to worse, just different. I mean, it is a unique sound listening to you playing basses simultaneously, and then it's a more standard, familiar sound with bass, drums, and piano, but it's exciting hearing the same track and the same recording done that way with that switch. And as we said, you can tell it's in real time. He's not punching it in later. How were the instruments configured in the studio? Was his bass baffled off, or was it just, how far was he traveling to get from his bass to his piano?
Very close. I mean, he stood about 10 feet from it. He played the upright bass. I had cabinets in another room, and they wired it out to the studio. Mike was there, and Mike was baffled off, and when Richard got finished playing bass, he would quietly lay it down. I kept playing, and he walked to the piano and continued to play. And I think they would probably mute the piano till he was ready to start. They didn't want any of that feedback. So.
Got it.
Not feedback, that bleed through, I should have said.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, the track I'm going to play to demonstrate this unique double bass sound, it is a Wayne Shorter composition, ESP, as made famous by Miles Davis. And it starts out with you playing an electric solo over the rhythm section of Richard and Mike, and then about midway through, he switches to piano and he solos over the rhythm section of you and Mike. So it's probably interesting for Mike Clark, too, to have the bass line jumping around from the instruments. And I have to say, it seems pretty cost-effective to be able to get the sound of 4 musicians for the price of 3.
Quite true. I'm an economic kind of guy.
So from the 2013 Low Standards album, here are Jeff Berlin, Mike Clark, and Richard Drexler performing
ESP. 1, 2, 1,
what does Richard Drexler consider to be his main instrument, the piano or the bass? Because obviously he plays both of them extremely well.
He considers them both equally his instrument. He does a lot of work as a pianist. He does a lot of work as a bass player. There's another guy up in Canada named Don Thompson who could do the same thing. There are a couple of guys that are, let's say, multi-instrumentally gifted. I think Gary Husband comes to mind as a drummer and pianist.
Yeah.
He played with John McLaughlin on piano, maybe even on drums. So he's one of those guys. But Richard regards both instruments as his forte, and he's right. He's great at both of them.
Well, let's talk about some of the other tracks on the album. One of my favorites sonically is Falling Grace. What technique are you employing on that one? Because it sounds different than the other tracks.
Well, I can't call it a technique as much as a harmonic idea that I had. I recall that there's a certain dissonance in certain music that I heard. So I thought it would sound really nice on an electric bass if I let notes sustain and bleed other notes in while another note is held over from a previous chord, which causes a lot of harmonic dissonance. And I was pleased with that track for that reason. I would think that that's one of the most different sort of recordings from a bass player who, for my reason to specifically go out of the harmony and then specifically allude to the next one and then resolve. So I was quite pleased. That's the first time I'd ever done that, and I did it that time when we were recording. I didn't plan it. It just happened, and that's the beauty of spontaneity in the area of jazz that I like to play as a leader or with other people. It was lovely. It was a lovely moment, and I appreciate that you noticed it.
Yeah, and I think it's a good example of what you mentioned earlier about not worrying about playing fast or anything and trying to find meaning in the music. Because even without intellectually knowing what you just described, it was a feeling. I could tell something different was going on, and there was sort of a gentleness to it and sort of a thoughtfulness to it. And it was still within this context of this unusual instrumentation. So that probably is my favorite one on there just sonically. It grabbed my attention. And we should mention that Richard doesn't switch instruments on every track. There's one where he stays on bass for the whole tune. That would be Wayne Shorter's Fee Fi Fo something. I forget the rest of the title. Fee Fi Fo.
You're gonna make me laugh, and I got a cold here.
That's a really cool one. I mean, I believe you actually do a version of that with Scott Henderson too, but.
Yeah, but I like that one. Maybe one of the best chordal bass pieces I ever played. That one was hard.
Yeah.
That one was hard. I did practice that one quite a bit. I found a lot of different harmony on that. Very, very proud of that. You got to forgive me, man. I'm kind of like saying in Yiddish, kvelling here, because I forgot. I don't pay attention to the records I do. I'm really quite proud of Low Standards, and it got great reviews, which of course means that it sold into the dozens. I never understood that. When you get
I was going to ask you later at the end how the bass community reacted to it, because it's such a bass-centric album. You and Richard are so good, and then you're doing something nobody's ever done before. I'd imagine bass players would just really be drawn to it.
Well, they're not. They're not, because I make music that's not quite sit down with a glass of wine and kick off your shoes. I'm kind of a guy that has a little bit of a challenge in the music that I provide.
I'm saying bass players, not just music.
And I'm talking about them.
Oh, really? They want to listen to you play and drink a glass of wine?
Well, it's kind of my analogy to the fact that what I do doesn't fit a mold, and also because I'm kind of a guy that pulls on the harmony, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't think that a lot of guys want to have that kind of a challenge to their ear.
Right, I see.
And I accept that. It's the way that things are today. Musicians are taught not to be challenged in music. They're taught to actually go the other way about it.
Well, I can imagine a clique of bass players going, here comes Jeff Berlin again, doing something that challenges us to try harder. And I could see sort of like, the lazy-ass players thinking that way.
Well, I certainly don't want to critique in using that term.
Well, I will for you. Well, just because you play something great, you get into this rut of same old. So as soon as you hear something different, even if it isn't your thing, you should be appreciative of just the fact that somebody's done something different. Then to have it, you, Richard Drexler, and Mike Clark, such skillful players on such a high level, I would think the bass community would go, hey, everybody, check out Low Standards. You never heard nothing like it. Great bass playing, but you're saying, they're like, give us something we know. That's weak, man.
Well, you see, it's the standard of function of bass in general. People today and on my instrument mean well, intend, to be loyal and honest regarding the music that they like and they like to play, but they're not encouraged to stretch and they're not encouraged to be into music. They're encouraged to be into something else. Obama said it yesterday. Nothing that's good in life comes easy. What did he say? Is that what he said in the State of the Union? Nothing that's good, nothing that has meaning in life is easy. And I loved that saying. But this doesn't apply to bass community, and I wish it would change.
Well, imagine if Bela Fleck had that attitude about the banjo. It's like, don't try and do anything different on that instrument. Just play it like everybody else. I mean, you need your explorers out there, people who take the instrument in different directions. So
I agree.
All I can say is that me personally, and from what I know about my listeners and from the reaction to last time you were on, a lot of them are going to be buying this. They better be. I'll be on their ass.
Well, I invite them if they're into bass and if they're into the varieties of way of playing, darn right, check it out. Because I would really like to share this music with people. It's kind of what happened even with certain artists way more known than me. Miles, he would sell records not that great, but then as his legend grew, the record sales went up later. This record did very well in reviews.
If you're a jazz reviewer and you review 50 CDs, there's going to be a lot of same old, same old. It's going to be a saxophone player playing the same Gershwin song we've already heard 500 times. So if your album is in the pile and they hear this, I can totally understand why it got positive reviews, because it's not just different, it's also good. You want to have that going for it too.
Thank you, bro. I appreciate that. A lot of people have shared that with me. Honestly, that's my compensation, and it's very, very kind. Very kind of you.
It's my honest, true opinion. Well, we were talking about fee, fi, fo, fum. I think that if I was told I could only grab one track off the whole album to sort of demonstrate the bass on bass, I'd probably have someone listen to that one. I'm not playing it today, but I think that's a good, sort of epitomizes it. You mentioned Carla Bley. That the composition Vashkar is the one where he just stays on the piano for the whole track.
Correct.
And that's a good example of what you mean by like a lesser known standard and some of these other ones. I would say probably Whisper Not is the most familiar composition in terms of you hear the melody. And, for me, it conjures up George Shearing and Mel Torme and people like that, who've done it. I think Bill Evans, the Very Early, which I believe is titled Very Early because he wrote it like in 1949. It was like one of the earliest things he did, so he just called it Very Early. That one has a nice flow to it, the version you guys did. And Wayne Shorter's El Gaucho you did. So, Wayne Shorter should be taking notice of these two albums and, that you're, honoring him and his writing so much. I mean, that dude you should do an album with him, man.
Well, I would love to if Wayne would be interested in having a guy like me, but it's hard to say. I'm not sure if I interest him. And I accept and understand that a guy of his genius has a vision of whom he wants. But you never know. He's still recording. He's a young man of 80, and that's not that vast in this world anymore. Perhaps we'll play. I would love to play with a. It would be an honor to play with a guy like Wayne.
I'd be curious to know if this next guy has heard your version of his stuff. This is going to lead into the next track I'm actually going to play.
Okay.
Many years ago, I started to notice this guy cropping up quite a bit in my Guitar Player magazine. He seemed to be getting a lot of gear endorsements, so I became curious enough about him to the extent that I bought his latest album. The name of the album was Off Ramp. The name of the guitarist, of course, was Pat Metheny. That whole Off Ramp album was outstanding, but the track that really blew me away is the track that you guys covered on Low Standards, the Pat Metheny, Lyle Mays collaboration, James. What inspired you guys to do that one?
Well, when I knew Pat in the old days, I should start there. He lived in Boston, and we used to hang and play. And one day I was at his house, and he said, I have this little tune. You want to play it? We played it together, James, before he recorded it. years later, we were discussing this album. I hadn't seen Pat in many, many years, but he was always a very nice man, a visionary, with a work ethic and an original approach. I knew him very well in the old days, and he made a comment that he wanted to fit somewhere between John McLaughlin and Jimi Hendrix, or was it John McLaughlin and Wes Montgomery? He mentioned two guys, and he did it. He honestly did it. He looked, sought, and conquered, and his vision was realized. So with that in mind, I said, I can play this on the bass and do a really good interpretation of this song on bass. And I think, and in some ways, it's the best song on the record. For me, for bass playing.
Well, it's not an accident that it's one of the ones I'm playing. And, I have a personal connection to it because, it was one of the first things I heard. As far as Pat Metheny and, Wes Montgomery, apparently when he first started, in Missouri, he was playing with his thumb, and he's basically a Wes Montgomery imitator. And the other players on the scene the older guys quickly told him, no, don't do that. You got to find your own thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the guys he was trying to be like. Now, I saw Pat Metheny on his tour for Letter from Home, and I saw him on his tour for We Live Here, and he didn't play James either time. And I was kind of surprised that it dropped out of their rotation because seems like it'd be fun for them to play. I guess they got tired of it. But as far as the version you guys did, on this one, Richard Drexler starts out on the piano just briefly, just to play that familiar piano intro. Then he switches to bass, and the two of you play the song form together. Then he solos on acoustic bass while you comp on electric. Then you solo on electric while he comps on acoustic. Then you and Mike do one of those vamps I mentioned where he puts his bass down, he goes back to the piano, and then he solos over you.
Yes.
And then you solo on the bass over his piano. So there's a ton of variety in this one. And plus, it's a great composition.
It's busy for a trio, isn't it? We did a lot of interplay, with interaction, up, down, down, up. We made full use of three guys. I like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything, and it's a tune that I'm so familiar with. And it's another good example of the bass on bass, but it also has every configuration of the piano, too. So that's why I wanted to play that one.
Wonderful.
Let's listen to it from the 2013 Low Standards album. Here is James.